Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of the bustling city park, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him, but the peaceful hum of life around him offered some respite. It was a brief moment of calm, until the sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. A small voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear, yet impossibly small. "Help me?" Keanu turned to see her, just a 6-year-old girl, standing alone in the shadow of a towering oak. Her eyes were wide, desperate. The world seemed to slow as he locked eyes with her. The park was filled with families, joggers, and street vendors, but in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. His pulse quickened. Something was wrong. The little girl took a hesitant step forward, her trembling hand reaching out. She whispered again, her words piercing through the fog of uncertainty. "Please help me." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Without a second thought, he reached for his phone, dialing 911 as his heart raced. What had she seen? What did she know? And more importantly, why her? Keanu Reeves, once the epitome of the action hero, had long since traded the bright lights of Hollywood for a quieter life. The fame, the accolades, the endless press tours. It had all become too much. After decades of high-octane roles, he had decided to step back. No longer did he need to be the hero on the silver screen. Now, he preferred being the quiet observer of life, moving through the world without fanfare. He lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Los Angeles, far from the glamorous studios and neon lights of Hollywood. The hum of the city was ever present, but it was more background noise than the constant buzz of his earlier life. His mornings were spent at the local coffee shop, where he could blend in with the regulars, artists, writers, teachers. People who didn't recognize him, who didn't care who he had been. Keanu had come to appreciate this anonymity, this peace. But even in the quiet corners of his life, there lingered a restlessness, the kind of ache that only comes from knowing you have more to give, but not knowing where to place it. It was a quiet loneliness, the kind that comes from the knowledge that there are still challenges to face, yet no clear path forward. Keanu had seen a lot in his years, both on-screen and off. He'd lost loved ones, battled personal demons, and witnessed the darker sides of fame and fortune. It had all shaped him into a man who preferred simplicity, but who also knew that the world had a way of throwing challenges when least expected. And on that particular afternoon, the challenge came in the form of a small voice in a city park. The park was a few blocks from his apartment, a place he often visited to clear his mind. It was filled with children playing, joggers weaving through the trees, and older folks chatting on benches. Life moved slowly here. It wasn't the bustling chaos of downtown. It was a place of serenity, where people came to escape the weight of their daily lives. But that serenity was about to shatter. Keanu was used to being alone, but that didn't mean he didn't notice people. The elderly man selling newspapers on the corner, the young woman walking her dog with a baby stroller in tow. They were familiar faces, small pieces of the puzzle that made up his world. Still, he kept to himself, observing life from the fringes, always mindful of his need for solitude. His friends, those few who knew him well, understood this. They had seen him through the years of personal loss and emotional rebuilding, and they had given him the space he needed. But today, there was no solitude. Today, everything changed. Keanu's hand was still gripping his phone, the dial tone echoing in his ear when the little girl stepped closer. Her face was pale, framed by messy hair that looked as though it had been tugged by a dozen winds. She wore a faded pink dress, its fabric torn at the hem, and her shoes were mismatched, one purple, one green. Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted around as if searching for someone or something. Her tiny frame trembled. "Please, please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the park's ambient noise. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. There was something off about the whole situation, something in the urgency of her plea. Why was she alone? Why hadn't anyone noticed her standing there, alone in a park filled with people? He kneeled down to her level, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Hey, what's your name? Keanu's voice was soft, steady. He tried to give her comfort, a semblance of normalcy in the chaos that seemed to swirl around them both. The little girl's lips quivered, and for a moment, she looked as though she might collapse. But then she found her voice again, her words coming out in a breathless rush. My brother? They took him. Her eyes flickered with a kind of panic Keanu had seen before, but never in such a young child. Keanu's stomach dropped. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. His mind flashed to dark scenarios, none of them good. Kidnapping, abduction, a violent crime that had just shattered the calm of the afternoon. Who took him, he asked, his voice taut with concern. But before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps broke their fragile bubble. Keanu glanced up and saw two men in dark clothing walking toward them. Their expressions were grim, their pace purposeful. The girl stiffened, her body going rigid as she glanced nervously toward them. Her eyes widened in fear, her breath shallow. Get away from her, one of the men called, his voice deep and commanding. The other man moved to flank him, his hand twitching near his waistband, as though ready to draw something. Keanu's instincts flared. He was no stranger to trouble, but this was different. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken danger. He stood slowly, placing himself between the men and the girl, his body tense, ready to protect her without thinking twice. Who are you? Keanu demanded, his voice low but firm, echoing with authority. The men exchanged a brief glance, the kind that said they weren't planning to give up easily. One of them reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a phone and snapping a quick photo of Keanu and the girl, then placing the phone back into his pocket. We're just looking for someone, the man said, his tone flat, dismissive. Stay out of it. Keanu's gaze remained steady, piercing through them. The girl's fear was palpable now, practically radiating from her. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Not happening, Keanu replied, stepping forward with a sudden determination he hadn't expected to feel. Everything inside him screamed that this moment would change everything. What was a quiet afternoon in the park had turned into something dangerous, something he couldn't ignore. Keanu's mind raced, his heart thundering in his chest as he watched the two men slowly circle around him and the girl. The park, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its open spaces closing in on him. The girl stood close to his side, trembling, clutching the hem of his jacket with a white-knuckled grip, her eyes flickering between him and the men. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived, her silence more unsettling than anything she could have said. Keanu remained standing firm, blocking her from the men's line of sight. His thoughts scrambled for a solution, any way to de-escalate the situation. He could see the tension in the men's movements, the way they inched closer, measuring his resolve. The decision was made for him. He couldn't just stand there and wait for something to happen. He had to act. For her. His hand went to his back pocket, feeling the reassuring shape of his phone. He hadn't called the police yet. He hadn't wanted to draw attention, but it was clear now that time was running out. With a steady hand, he dialed again, his thumb pressing the familiar numbers as he kept his eyes trained on the men. One of the men, the taller one, raised an eyebrow when he saw Keanu's movement. You've got a lot of nerve, old man, he said, his voice cold and mocking. You don't want to do this. Keanu met his gaze without flinching, all the while making sure the girl stayed hidden behind him. You're making a mistake, Keanu said, his voice low, calm. It was a warning, not a threat, but the man didn't seem to care. The girl tugged at Keanu's sleeve, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. Please, they'll hurt you. Keanu's heart twisted. He had no idea what the men were capable of, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them take her. Not when she was looking at him like this. Not when she was trusting him in a way that seemed impossible for someone so young. The men didn't seem fazed by her words. Instead, they took a few more steps forward, their movements deliberate. Keanu's finger hovered over the call button on his phone, But before he could press it, a voice from behind him startled him. "You need help." Keanu turned quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the small of his back as if to brace himself for another threat. But when he saw who had spoken, his posture softened slightly. It was an older man, maybe in his mid-60s, wearing a well-worn leather jacket and a cap that barely contained his wild white hair. His wrinkled face was marked by the years, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something steady, like he'd seen it all before. "Who are you?" Keanu asked, his suspicion still lingering in the air. The man took a slow step forward, hands raised in a peaceful gesture. "Just someone who knows when trouble's brewing," he said with a small smile. "And it looks like you're in the middle of it." Keanu glanced back at the men, still closing in, and then down at the girl. She was still gripping his jacket, her small body trembling in fear. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed a way out, fast. "What do you want?" Keanu asked, his voice sharp but trying to remain composed. The taller man stepped forward, a smug grin playing across his face. "We don't want any trouble," he said, his words laced with thinly veiled menace. "We just want the girl. Hand her over." Keanu's stomach turned at the thought. This wasn't just about a child being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was something darker, something deeper. He couldn't let them take her. He wouldn't. "I don't think you understand," Keanu said, his tone hardening. "I'm not giving her to anyone." The man's grin faltered for a second, and that hesitation was enough for Keanu to act. His eyes darted to the older man, who had been quietly watching the exchange, waiting for the right moment. "I've got a plan," the older man said, his voice calm and steady, like he'd been in situations just like this before. "But you need to trust me." Keanu hesitated for only a moment before nodding. What choice did he have? The older man motioned for Keanu to step back slightly, and with the briefest of movements, he slipped a small object from his jacket pocket. Something shiny. It was a stun gun, small but effective, hidden in the folds of his coat. Without another word, he advanced toward the two men, his movements smooth and practiced. "Don't make me use this," the older man said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to catch the taller man off guard. "Walk away." For a moment, the taller man hesitated, the slightest twitch of uncertainty in his eyes. The older man's presence seemed to carry weight, a reminder that not everyone in this world was afraid of confrontation. That fact alone made the taller man falter. And in that moment, Keanu seized the opportunity. With a sudden burst of motion, he stepped forward, blocking the men's path entirely. "We're done here," he said firmly, his voice a calm but undeniable force. The men stood still, uncertain, measuring the situation. The taller one glanced at his companion, who was still looking at the older man with a mix of confusion and doubt. Then, after a long, pregnant silence, the two men exchanged a brief nod. They didn't need to say anything. They knew when the odds were no longer in their favor. "We'll be back," the taller man muttered under his breath, before turning and walking away, his companion following silently behind. Keanu didn't move until they were completely out of sight, the weight in his chest beginning to lift. He was alive. The girl was safe. But there was a lingering unease in the air that wouldn't go away so easily. The older man turned to Keanu, his expression softening. "You did good," he said, his tone sincere. Keanu let out a shaky breath. His heart was still racing. "Thanks," he said, his voice strained with the adrenaline. "But I don't know what's going on here. What did they want with her?" The older man's face grew serious. He glanced at the girl, who was still standing behind Keanu, her hands clutching him tightly. "I think it's time you found out," he said quietly. "But it won't be easy." Keanu nodded, feeling the weight of the unknown settle on his shoulders. The girl's future, whatever it was, had just become his responsibility. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was certain. He wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the city park as Keanu and the older man, whose name he had learned was Frank, made their way toward an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The girl, who had introduced herself as Emma, walked silently beside him, her hand gripping his sleeve like a lifeline. Her eyes were vacant, distant, as though the world around her was slipping away, and she had no choice but to follow. Keanu couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. What had those men been involved in? Why had they wanted her so badly? Frank had been vague, only offering cryptic warnings and hints that didn't add up. Keanu's instincts told him they were walking into something far bigger than he'd expected. He wasn't just protecting a scared child now. He was walking into the heart of something dangerous, something that had the potential to destroy lives. Frank led the way, his eyes scanning their surroundings with the sharpness of someone who had seen too much. They stopped at the entrance of the warehouse, an imposing structure that loomed before them like a tomb. Keanu's hand instinctively went to his phone again, but he paused before dialing. He couldn't risk drawing attention. There was no telling who might be inside. His stomach tightened, and the weight of responsibility pressed down harder. "Are you sure about this?" Keanu asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the darkened doorway. Frank's expression remained grim. "If we don't stop this now, it's only going to get worse. Those men, they're part of something bigger, a syndicate. And Emma, they were looking for her because she's the key. Whatever's going on, she's in the center of it." Keanu swallowed, his mind racing. The stakes had just been raised. What could a 6-year-old girl possibly have to do with a criminal syndicate? And what was it about her that made her so valuable? Frank glanced down at Emma, his expression softening for the first time. "This is your choice, Keanu. But if you walk through that door, there's no turning back. They'll stop at nothing to get to her." Keanu's eyes locked with Frank's, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. He had already walked too far to turn back. Emma's safety was more important than anything else. His past as an action star had taught him how to fight, how to survive in dangerous situations. But this was different. This was about something much deeper than the physical. This was about protecting innocence at all costs. He turned to Emma, who was staring up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "You're not alone. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Whatever this is, we'll face it together." She nodded faintly, her lips trembling, but her grip on his sleeve tightened. Keanu took a deep breath and nodded at Frank. "Let's go." The air in the warehouse was thick with dust and stale air, the silence hanging heavy like a thick fog. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and Keanu's senses were on high alert. He could hear the faint sounds of voices ahead, muffled by the walls, but they were unmistakable. They were close. As they crept forward, Keanu's thoughts flashed to his earlier life. The life where he had been part of the world that thrived on violence, a world where his fists and his skills were enough to protect those he cared about. But this was different. This wasn't about physical strength. This was about integrity. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing a group of men, all dressed in dark suits, their cold eyes fixed on Emma. The leader, the same man Keanu had seen in the park, stepped forward with a smug expression, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. Well, looks like we got a little party," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Thought you could play the hero, huh?" Keanu didn't flinch. His heart was steady, his focus absolute. "I'm done running," he said, his voice steady. "You're not taking her." The man laughed, a low, humorless chuckle. "You really think you can stop us? You're just a washed-up actor. You have no idea what you're dealing with." But Keanu's eyes never wavered. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," he said, "and I'm not backing down. Not this time." The leader's grin faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. The others behind him shuffled, uneasy. Keanu wasn't sure how much longer they could keep up the facade of power. He knew this wasn't about brute force. It was about taking a stand, about making it clear that this wasn't just about the money or the power or even the violence. This was about Emma's life, and he wasn't going to let anyone threaten that. Without warning, the leader stepped forward, his hand suddenly reaching for a weapon at his side. Keanu reacted instantly, moving in front of Emma, shielding her with his own body. Frank, who had remained at Keanu's side, lunged at the leader, tackling him to the ground in one swift motion. The room erupted in chaos. Shouts, the sound of punches landing, feet shuffling across the concrete floor. Everything blurred into a frenzy of noise and motion. Keanu fought with the precision and focus he'd once used on the screen, but now it was all real. Every hit, every movement was driven by the desperate need to protect. In the midst of the chaos, Keanu found himself face to face with the leader once more. The man was on the ground, struggling to get to his feet, his eyes burning with fury. "You don't know what you've just done," he spat. "This is bigger than you, bigger than her." Keanu's response was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he'd learned in his life, everything he'd come to believe in. It doesn't matter how big you are. No one is too big to lose. With that, Keanu stepped forward, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in one final, decisive blow. The man crumpled to the ground unconscious. The room fell silent. The tension in the air was palpable as Keanu stood, his chest heaving with exertion. The battle was over. The danger had passed for now. Emma, who had been trembling behind him, stepped out from her hiding place, her small face flushed with relief. Keanu dropped to one knee, his eyes softening as he met her gaze. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I promised I'd protect you, and I meant it." In that moment, Keanu realized something. He had been waiting for a chance to make a real difference in the world. And now, in the face of true danger, he had found it. He wasn't just the action hero anymore. He was a man who had learned what it meant to truly fight for something. Not for fame, not for glory, but for what mattered most. The aftermath of the chaos was a stillness that felt heavier than the violence. The warehouse, now echoing only the faint sound of Keanu's labored breathing, was littered with men groaning on the floor, some unconscious, others too stunned to move. Frank stood nearby, keeping a wary eye on the fallen, while Keanu checked on Emma, whose wide eyes had finally begun to soften, her breath slowing from the panicked gasp that had been moments before. "Are you okay?" Keanu asked softly, crouching in front of her. The urgency that had driven him during the fight had subsided, replaced by a deep tenderness that he hadn't known he was capable of. His life had been full of fight scenes and high-octane moments, but this was different. This was real. Emma nodded, her small face still pale, but her lips curling into a tentative smile. "I'm okay. Thank you for helping me." Keanu's heart swelled at her words, and for a moment he just looked at her, feeling the full weight of what he had just done, what he had just promised to protect. She wasn't just a child he had to save anymore. She was a person he cared about. She had become his responsibility, a bond forged not in the fire of violence, but in the shared knowledge of what it meant to protect someone completely, without question. Frank, who had been silently watching their exchange, approached, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the aftermath. "It's over," he said simply, his voice low but relieved. "You did well, Keanu. You stood your ground." Keanu gave him a tired but genuine smile. "Thanks. Couldn't have done it without you." Frank gave a gruff chuckle. "We're not out of the woods yet. There's a lot more to this than just those men. They're part of something much larger, and you've only scratched the surface." Keanu's gaze drifted over to the men, now subdued but not entirely out of the picture. The leader of the group stirred slightly, but he was out for the count. Keanu had no illusions about the fight he'd just won. It was only a battle in a much larger war. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of clarity, a sense that this fight, whatever it would become, was worth every ounce of his effort. The air was thick with the weight of the moment, the realization of how far he'd come in such a short time. He'd gone from a man who had been only concerned with his own survival and success to someone who now understood the true cost of ignoring the needs of others. He had made a choice to step into a world that didn't owe him anything and fight for what was right. Not for a paycheck, not for fame, but because he couldn't stand by and let innocence be taken, and that, Keanu realized, was worth more than anything else in the world. "Where do we go from here?" Keanu asked, his voice steady but reflective. He looked at Frank, who had become an unlikely ally and a mentor of sorts. The older man had been more than just a guide. He had been a reminder that no one was too far gone to make a difference. Frank's answer was simple. "We keep moving forward, and we make sure she's safe. We do what's necessary to put an end to this." Keanu nodded, but his thoughts drifted to Emma. Her hand was still clasped tightly around his, the bond between them now unspoken but undeniable. She wasn't just a scared child anymore. She had become a symbol of what was worth fighting for. His responsibility to her had awakened something deep inside him, a desire to protect, to be the person who could stand up when no one else could, to fight for the helpless. The next few days were a blur of activity. Frank had connections that allowed them to track down the remaining members of the syndicate, working in the shadows to ensure Emma's safety and to gather the necessary information to bring down the operation. Keanu had expected the rush of adrenaline to be the hardest part, but it wasn't the battles that were most exhausting. It was the waiting, the quiet moments when they would hide in plain sight, constantly on edge, knowing the enemy was out there, always watching. He had never been more aware of the fragility of the situation, but he had also never been more determined to see it through. Emma had started to open up to him, little by little. Her fear had not disappeared overnight, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there when he first met her. It wasn't just hope, it was trust. She had placed her faith in him, and that had become the most precious thing Keanu had ever carried. On the 5th day, they finally got the breakthrough they needed. A tip from one of Frank's old contacts led them to a safe house where the rest of the syndicate had been operating out of. Keanu and Frank, both well prepared for what was coming, made their way in with silent determination. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about taking down the heart of the organization, ensuring that no one else would ever have to live through what Emma had endured. In the end, they succeeded. The syndicate was dismantled, its key members arrested, and Emma was finally free to live without fear. But the journey didn't end there. Keanu didn't just walk away with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. He walked away with a new understanding of himself. A man who had once sought purpose in fame and fortune, but now understood that true purpose came from the quiet moments of selflessness, from the courage to protect what mattered most. Emma was sent to a new, safe life with a family who would love and protect her as she deserved. Keanu had kept his promise, but the promise he had made to himself, of transformation, of understanding the power of doing the right thing, no matter the cost, was the one that would linger long after the danger had passed. As Keanu watched her drive away with her new family, he stood there, a smile pulling at the corner of his lips. He had given her a future, and in doing so, he had found his own. The world was still full of darkness, full of things he couldn't change. But he had changed, and that, he realized, was enough. Sometimes, it only takes one moment, one decision, one person, to change everything. And Keanu Reeves had become that person. For Emma, for himself, for the world. And that was enough. Years passed, and the world kept turning. Keanu never forgot the girl he had saved. Emma, now a teenager, had grown into someone strong, someone who had found her place in the world. She had been adopted by a kind family, her scars slowly fading into the background as she learned to live without fear. Keanu occasionally received updates, small glimpses into her life, graduations, achievements, moments of joy that proved she was free, truly free, to be whoever she wanted to be. Keanu's own life had transformed in ways he hadn't expected. The journey he had embarked on with Emma had changed him. No longer just a man defined by his past fame, he had become a quieter figure, someone who now spent his time helping those in need, advocating for causes that mattered to him. He had become involved with various charities, using his platform not for publicity, but to support and uplift those who couldn't fight for themselves. And though he would always carry the lessons learned from that experience, There was one moment he thought of more than any other. The quiet smile Emma had given him on that day in the warehouse. The trust in her eyes, the hope that had flickered to life within her once more. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones you win on the front lines, but the ones you win within yourself. Keanu had come to understand that, and as he stood on the edge of another day, a deep sense of peace washed over him. In the end, it wasn't about the fights he won or the fame he achieved. It was about the people whose lives he had touched and how he, too, had been touched in return. And that was the greatest victory of all.